There comes a moment in a man's life when he quietly accepts that the happiest days he will ever know are already behind him. It doesn't happen with a dramatic goodbye or a heartbreaking speech. It happens in the silence, in the empty chair across the dinner table, in the untouched side of the bed, and the routine that slowly replaces hope. Just before sunrise, Mason Reed sat alone on a weathered bench overlooking a calm lake. The world around him was waking up, but something inside him had gone still years ago. His wedding ring was gone, yet the faint mark it had left on his finger remained, like a memory that refused to disappear. At 53, Mason believed love had already taken everything it intended to give him. He had spent years convincing himself that some stories simply don't get happy endings. Then, on one ordinary Tuesday morning, inside a quiet neighborhood bookstore, a woman he had never seen before smiled at him. It lasted only a few seconds, but somehow it reached a place inside him that had been closed for years. Mason had no way of knowing that this brief encounter would challenge everything he believed about loss, forgiveness, and second chances. Was she simply a stranger passing through his life? Or was she someone whose path had been quietly leading toward his all along? Why did that simple smile feel strangely familiar? What had happened years earlier that convinced him never to trust his heart again? And why would a man who had spent so many years avoiding love suddenly begin questioning every promise he had made to himself? The answers would take us through years of heartbreak, unexpected discoveries, impossible choices, and moments that seemed too meaningful to dismiss as coincidence. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Mason's story is inspired by the experiences of countless Americans whose lives were forever changed after losing a spouse, enduring divorce, or believing they were simply too old to begin again. Across the United States, many men in their 50s and 60s quietly rebuild their lives after devastating emotional loss, often believing that companionship is something reserved for younger generations. Yet time and again, remarkable stories emerge of unexpected meetings in grocery stores, libraries, coffee shops, churches, community events, and bookstores, where ordinary moments become life-changing turning points. While the names and identifying details in this story have been changed to protect privacy, the emotions, struggles, and life lessons reflect real experiences shared by people who once believed love had passed them by forever. As Mason watched the first rays of sunlight stretch across the water, he had no idea that the choices he was about to make would force him to confront the one thing he had spent years trying to bury. Because sometimes the hardest journey isn't learning how to love someone else. Sometimes it's finding the courage to believe that your own heart still deserves to be loved. And as impossible as it sounded, everything began with a smile from a woman named Laura Bennett. A smile that seemed ordinary to everyone else, but to Mason Reed, it felt like the first page of a story he never imagined he would have the chance to live. There comes a point when a man becomes so accustomed to loneliness that he no longer sees it as a temporary season of life. Instead, it becomes part of who he is. For Mason Reed, that realization arrived gradually over the course of several years. At 53 years old, he had mastered the art of appearing fine. To his co-workers, he seemed dependable. To his neighbors, he seemed friendly. To his children, he seemed strong. But the truth was far different. Every morning, Mason woke up to a silent house. He brewed the same cup of coffee, read the same section of the newspaper, drove the same route to work, and returned each evening to rooms that felt larger than they should have. The laughter that once filled those rooms had long since disappeared. The dreams he once carried had quietly faded into memories. From the outside, his life looked stable. Inside, it felt unfinished. Years earlier, Mason had believed he had everything he would ever need. He had built a life around love, trust, and the promise of growing old with someone who understood him better than anyone else. He wasn't the kind of man who chased excitement. He valued loyalty. He valued commitment. He believed that if two people worked hard enough, they could survive almost anything. For a long time, that belief served him well. Then life delivered a lesson he never saw coming. The relationship he had built his future around eventually came to an end, leaving behind questions that never seemed to find answers. The pain was not limited to losing someone. It was losing the version of himself that existed when he believed the future was certain. Friends encouraged him to move on. Family reminded him that he still had many good years ahead. But advice is easy to give when you're standing outside someone else's pain. Mason listened politely, nodded when expected, and continued living behind emotional walls that grew stronger with each passing year. As time passed, people stopped asking if he was dating anyone. The invitations to social gatherings became less frequent. The blind dates arranged by well-meaning friends eventually disappeared. It was as though everyone had accepted the same conclusion Mason had reached himself. His chapter of romance was over. What remained was routine, safe, predictable, and emotionally distant. The strange thing about loneliness is that it doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it feels ordinary. It settles into your life. The bookstore was nearly empty. Soft music played in the background. A handful of customers browsed shelves near the front entrance. Mason made his way toward the history section, scanning titles without paying much attention. Then something happened that would stay with him for years. Reaching for a book on the top shelf, he felt another hand touch it at the exact same moment. Instinctively, he pulled back. So did the other person. When he turned to apologize, he found himself looking into the eyes of a woman he had never seen before. She smiled. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No music played. No lightning struck. Yet something about that smile felt strangely familiar. Warm, genuine, unforced. For the first time in years, Mason felt something shift inside him. A feeling he couldn't explain. A feeling he wasn't sure he wanted to trust. The woman laughed softly and insisted he take the book. Mason joked that she had reached it first. Their conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. They exchanged a few polite comments, shared a brief laugh, and then she walked away. That should have been the end of it. Thousands of strangers cross paths every day without ever seeing each other again. Yet as Mason continued browsing the shelves, he found himself thinking about her. There was nothing extraordinary about the encounter itself. What troubled him was how much it affected him. Why couldn't he stop replaying those few minutes in his mind? Why did he feel as though he had forgotten something important and was only now beginning to remember it? He tried dismissing the thought as meaningless. After all, she was a stranger. A pleasant stranger, perhaps, but still a stranger. When Mason finally left the bookstore that afternoon, the rain had stopped. The clouds were beginning to break apart, allowing sunlight to filter through. He walked toward his car, expecting the strange feeling to fade. Instead, it followed him home. That night, as he sat alone in his living room, he caught himself wondering about the woman again. Who was she? Why had she seemed so familiar? And why, after years of emotional distance, did one brief encounter feel powerful enough to disturb the carefully constructed life he had spent so long protecting? Mason didn't realize it yet, but the answers to those questions would challenge everything he believed about coincidence, timing, and the possibility of beginning again. Because this was not merely the story of a man meeting a woman. It was the story of two lives carrying hidden wounds, slowly moving toward an encounter neither of them could fully understand. And as Mason prepared for bed that night, convinced he would never see her again, fate was already arranging the next chapter of a story that was only beginning. Mason Reed woke the following morning determined to put the encounter behind him. He told himself it had been nothing more than a brief conversation between two strangers brought together by coincidence. After all, people met in bookstores every day, exchanged polite smiles, and continued with their lives. There was no reason to believe this moment carried any greater meaning. Yet as he poured his morning coffee, he found himself thinking about the woman again. He could still picture the kindness in her eyes and the effortless way she smiled, not out of obligation, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to appreciate life's simple moments. Mason wasn't looking for romance. In fact, he had spent years making sure romance never found him again. Still, for reasons he couldn't explain, he caught himself wondering whether she had purchased the book they had both reached for or whether she had simply walked away empty-handed, just as he had. Life quickly returned to its familiar rhythm. Mason went to work, completed his projects, shared brief conversations with coworkers, and drove home each evening as he always had. Yet something had changed. The routine no longer felt as empty as it once did because his mind kept drifting back to that bookstore. Several days later, while stopping at a neighborhood coffee shop before work, Mason stood in line waiting for his order when he heard a familiar laugh. He turned slowly, almost afraid to confirm what he already suspected. There she was, the same woman from the bookstore. She was seated near the window, reading a novel while stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. For a brief moment, he considered pretending he hadn't noticed her. Old habits encouraged distance. Protect your heart. Keep moving. Don't complicate your life. But before he could make his decision, she looked up, recognized him instantly, and smiled once again. Bookstore history expert, she joked warmly as he approached her table. Mason laughed, surprised that she remembered him. They spoke for only a few minutes before he had to leave for work. Yet this conversation felt different. Her name, she explained, was Laura Bennett. She had recently moved back to town after spending several years caring for an aging family member in another state. She spoke calmly, never oversharing, never trying to impress anyone. Mason noticed that she listened carefully whenever he spoke, something he hadn't experienced in a very long time. Before leaving, Laura wished him a good day, and Mason walked toward his car carrying an unfamiliar feeling. He realized he was smiling. It had happened naturally without effort. It had been so long since someone had made him forget the weight he carried that he almost didn't recognize the feeling. Over the following weeks, their paths continued crossing in ways that felt increasingly difficult to dismiss as simple chance. One Saturday morning, Mason saw Laura browsing fresh produce at the local farmer's market. A few days later, she appeared at the public library while he was returning a biography he had finished reading. Then, during an evening walk through a quiet park overlooking the river, he noticed her feeding ducks near the water. Neither of them planned these meetings. Neither exchanged phone numbers. Every encounter seemed to happen naturally, as though life itself kept placing them in the same places at exactly the right moments. Mason's practical side insisted coincidence was the only explanation. Yet another part of him quietly wondered if there were moments in life that couldn't be explained so easily. Their conversations slowly became longer. They spoke about favorite authors, childhood memories, American road trips, classic movies, and the little traditions that made life meaningful. Laura never asked painful questions about Mason's past, and Mason appreciated that more than she probably realized. She allowed silence to exist without feeling uncomfortable. Sometimes they simply sat together on a park bench watching people pass by, saying very little. Surprisingly, those quiet moments became the ones Mason treasured most. For years, he had believed meaningful conversations required grand words. Laura reminded him that genuine companionship often lived in comfortable silence. She laughed easily, but carried moments of reflection that hinted at experiences she had not yet shared. Mason sensed she had known heartbreak too, though he respected her privacy enough not to ask. Friends who had watched Mason withdraw from life began noticing subtle changes. His daughter, Emily, commented during one weekend visit that he seemed lighter somehow. His longtime friend Daniel joked that Mason had started shaving every morning instead of every other day. Even Mason noticed himself paying closer attention to details he had ignored for years. He found himself choosing nicer shirts before leaving home and lingering a little longer in places where he thought Laura might appear. None of this made sense to him. He had spent years convincing himself that those parts of his life were over. Yet here he was, quietly hoping for another unexpected conversation with a woman he barely knew. The realization frightened him almost as much as it excited him, because hope carries risk, and risk was something Mason had carefully avoided ever since his heart had been broken. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. Mason was leaving the bookstore where their story had first begun when Laura stepped through the entrance carrying a small stack of novels. They laughed about meeting there again, and after several minutes of conversation, Laura looked at him thoughtfully before asking a simple question that caught him completely off guard. "Mason," she said with quiet confidence, "would you like to have dinner with me sometime?" The words seemed almost impossible to process. No one had asked him that question in years. For a brief moment, every painful memory from his past rushed back into his mind, reminding him why he had promised never to open his heart again. Yet standing before him was a woman whose kindness had slowly begun breaking through walls he believed would never come down. Mason hesitated, not because he didn't want to say yes, but because saying yes meant accepting the possibility that his life was about to change forever. Little did he know, the greatest challenge wasn't deciding whether to trust Laura. It was discovering whether both of them were truly free from the past they had tried so hard to leave behind. Mason stood in the bookstore for what felt like an eternity, even though only a few seconds had passed. Laura's invitation lingered in the air as he searched for the right words. Part of him wanted to decline politely, retreat to the familiar safety of his quiet routine, and convince himself that nothing good could come from opening his heart again. The other part, the part he had almost forgotten still existed, whispered that opportunities like this rarely arrive twice. He looked into Laura's eyes and saw no pressure, no expectations, only sincerity. Finally, he smiled and accepted. It wasn't a grand declaration or the beginning of an unbelievable romance. It was simply two adults agreeing to share a meal. Yet for Mason, it felt like taking his first real step after years of standing still. As they agreed to meet the following Friday evening, he walked back to his car with a mixture of excitement and fear, wondering whether he had just made the best decision of his life or the biggest mistake. Their first dinner was nothing like the dates Mason remembered from years ago. There were no awkward attempts to impress each other or exaggerated stories designed to appear more interesting. They spoke honestly about ordinary things. Laura shared stories about growing up in a small Midwestern town where neighbors knew one another by name and front porches were places for conversations rather than decoration. Mason spoke about his years working as a civil engineer, the satisfaction he found in building things that lasted, and how retirement was beginning to feel closer than he had ever imagined. They laughed over childhood memories, favorite family recipes, old movies they both loved, and places across America they still hope to visit someday. For the first time in years, Mason noticed something unusual. He wasn't checking the time. He wasn't thinking about leaving. He simply enjoyed being present. Weeks turned into months, and their friendship slowly became something deeper. They discovered a rhythm that felt natural. Saturday mornings often began with breakfast at a quiet diner before exploring nearby antique shops or local farmers markets. On warm evenings, they walked beside the lake where Mason had once sat alone, believing his future had already been written. Laura encouraged him to take photographs again, a hobby he had abandoned after his life changed years earlier. Together, they visited small museums, attended outdoor concerts, and even volunteered at community charity events. Mason found himself laughing more often than he had in nearly a decade. Friends who hadn't seen him in months remarked that he looked younger, healthier, happier. His daughter, Emily, noticed that the sadness which had once settled permanently behind his eyes had begun to fade. She had quietly prayed for years that someone might remind her father he was still capable of loving and being loved. Laura, however, remained something of a mystery. She spoke warmly about the present, but rarely discussed her past in detail. Whenever conversations drifted toward previous relationships or painful memories, she gently redirected them without appearing uncomfortable. Mason respected those boundaries because he carried wounds of his own. He believed everyone deserved the right to reveal their story in their own time. Yet there were moments that left him wondering. Occasionally, Laura would pause while looking at old couples holding hands in the park, as though remembering someone she had once known. Sometimes she seemed distracted after receiving certain phone calls, excusing herself briefly before returning with a reassuring smile that never quite reached her eyes. Mason noticed these moments but chose not to press her. Trust, he believed, was built through patience, not interrogation. Then, without warning, everything changed. One Monday morning, Mason sent Laura a simple message wishing her a good day. Hours passed without a reply. By evening, he assumed she had become busy. The following day, there was still no response. He called her phone, but it went directly to voicemail. Wednesday came and went with nothing. Thursday followed the same pattern. By Friday, the familiar weight he thought he had left behind settled heavily on his shoulders once again. Every unanswered message reopened old emotional scars he believed had finally healed. His mind filled with questions he couldn't silence. Had he misunderstood everything? Had Laura simply decided to leave without explanation? Was history repeating itself in a different form? The fear wasn't merely about losing someone he cared about. It was about confirming the belief that he had carried for years, that every time he allowed himself to hope, disappointment would eventually find him. For 7 long days, Mason heard nothing. He tried focusing on work, but concentration became nearly impossible. Every ringtone made him glance toward his phone. Every unfamiliar car passing his house made him wonder if Laura had returned. Emily noticed the change immediately and gently reminded her father not to assume the worst before knowing the truth. Daniel suggested there might be a reasonable explanation, but Mason had lived long enough to know that silence often speaks louder than words. Memories he had fought so hard to overcome resurfaced one after another. He questioned whether opening his heart again had been foolish. Perhaps loneliness was easier than risking another heartbreak. Perhaps he should have listened to the cautious voice that warned him not to trust happiness when it unexpectedly arrived. Then, on the evening of the 8th day, there was a knock at his front door. Mason opened it slowly, and there stood Laura. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were swollen, as though she hadn't slept properly in days. Before Mason could ask a single question, she quietly apologized for disappearing. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from emotional exhaustion. Mason wanted answers, yet seeing the pain on her face softened the frustration he had carried all week. They sat together on the porch in complete silence for several moments before Laura finally spoke words that neither of them would ever forget. "Mason," she whispered, struggling to hold back tears, "there's something about my past I've been trying to find the courage to tell you. I never wanted to hurt you, and I never meant to disappear. But if I tell you the truth about where I've been and why I left without saying goodbye, there's a chance you'll never want to see me again." At that moment, Mason realized their story had never simply been about finding love. It was about confronting the secrets, grief, and unfinished chapters that both of them had carried for far too long. The future they had quietly begun imagining together now rested on a truth that had remained hidden until this very moment. The evening air had turned cool, but neither Mason nor Laura seemed to notice. They remained seated on the porch, separated by only a few inches, yet carrying years of emotional distance within themselves. Mason looked at Laura without speaking. He had imagined countless explanations during the week she disappeared. Perhaps she had changed her mind. Perhaps she had met someone else. Perhaps she had decided that allowing another man into her life simply wasn't worth the risk. But the expression on her face told a different story. This wasn't guilt. It wasn't regret. It was the look of someone who had been carrying an invisible burden for far longer than anyone realized. Mason resisted the urge to interrupt. Over the years, he had learned that some truths cannot be rushed. They arrive only when the person telling them has finally gathered enough courage to face them. Laura took a slow breath before beginning. 12 years ago, she said quietly, I thought I had my entire future planned. She explained that she had been married to a man named Michael, someone she had loved deeply since they were both in their 20s. Together, they had built a modest but happy life filled with dreams that seemed ordinary at the time, but became priceless in memory. Weekend road trips through the mountains, family cookouts on summer holidays, handwritten anniversary letters, and quiet evenings spent planning the years ahead. Like many couples, they assumed there would always be another tomorrow. Then, without warning, everything changed. Michael was diagnosed with an aggressive illness that progressed far faster than anyone expected. Within months, Laura found herself sitting beside a hospital bed instead of planning vacations. She watched the strongest man she had ever known slowly lose the future they had imagined together. When he passed away, it wasn't just her husband she lost. It was the life she believed they would share for decades. For years afterward, Laura survived rather than lived. Friends encouraged her to move forward, but she couldn't imagine opening her heart to anyone else. She buried herself in work, cared for aging relatives, and convinced herself that loneliness was simply the price of loving someone completely. Whenever someone showed interest in her, she politely declined. It wasn't because those men lacked kindness. It was because accepting their affection felt like betraying the memories she had worked so hard to protect. She carried guilt that no one else could see. Guilt for laughing again. Guilt for enjoying life. Even guilt for imagining happiness after devastating loss. Eventually, she stopped allowing herself to imagine another relationship altogether. It seemed easier that way. Safer. Then she met Mason in the bookstore, and everything she believed she had settled suddenly became uncertain again. Laura admitted that every conversation they shared made those carefully built emotional walls begin to crack. The more time she spent with Mason, the more she realized she wasn't replacing the love she had once known. She was discovering that the human heart has an extraordinary capacity to honor the past while still making room for the future. That realization frightened her more than she expected. Then, only days before she disappeared, she received a phone call from an attorney in another state. Michael's late father's estate, which had remained tied up in legal matters for years, was finally being settled. Several important documents required Laura's personal signature, and there were personal belongings that had remained untouched since Michael's passing. She could have postponed the trip. She could have ignored the call. But something inside her told her she needed to face that chapter completely before she could honestly begin another. The journey forced Laura to revisit memories she had avoided for more than a decade. She walked through the old family home where photographs still lined the hallway. She opened boxes containing handwritten letters, vacation postcards, birthday cards, and a leather journal Michael had kept during the final months of his illness. Inside its pages, she discovered words she had never read before. He had written about his greatest fear, not dying, but leaving Laura alone, believing that loving someone else would somehow diminish what they had shared. One entry stopped her completely. If life gives Laura another chance to smile after I'm gone, he had written, I hope she takes it. Loving again would never erase me. It would simply mean life was kind enough to give her happiness twice. Laura confessed that she sat alone for hours reading those words through tears. They became the permission she had unknowingly been searching for all these years. When she finally looked back at Mason, tears filled both of their eyes. He understood that her disappearance had never been about running away from him. It had been about confronting the past before she could fully embrace the future. Laura apologized for leaving without explaining, admitting that she feared he would misunderstand her silence or decide that her emotional baggage was simply too much. Mason reached for her hand, holding it gently as he reflected on his own years of grief. For so long, Both of them had mistaken survival for healing. They had built comfortable lives around their pain, believing it protected them from future heartbreak. In reality, those walls had also kept out hope, joy, and the possibility of discovering that love could return in a different form without replacing what came before. As the night grew darker, Mason realized that Laura's story had answered far more than the question of where she had been. It had forced him to examine the fears he still carried within himself. If Laura could find the courage to face 12 years of grief and finally choose hope again, perhaps he could do the same. Yet another question remained unanswered. Could two people who had spent years protecting their wounded hearts truly build a future together without allowing the shadows of the past to follow them? Neither of them knew the answer. But as they sat together beneath the quiet evening sky, one thing had become clear. Their greatest obstacle was no longer the pain they had endured. It was deciding whether they were finally ready to believe that life sometimes offers a second chance. Not to replace the love that was lost, but to remind us that the heart can heal without forgetting. The decision they made next would determine whether their remarkable journey became another story of heartbreak or the beginning of the chapter both of them had secretly been hoping still existed. For the first time in many years, Mason Reed no longer felt as though he was running from his past. He wasn't trying to erase it either. As he sat beside Laura that evening, listening to the sounds of crickets in the distance and watching the porch light cast gentle shadows across the yard, he understood something that had taken him more than a decade to learn. Healing doesn't happen when memories disappear. Healing begins when those memories stop controlling the choices we make today. Both he and Laura had spent years believing they were protecting themselves from future pain. In reality, they had been protecting themselves from future happiness as well. They had mistaken emotional distance for strength, solitude for peace, and routine for contentment. Now, sitting together in comfortable silence, they realized they had been surviving when life had quietly been inviting them to start living again. The weeks that followed felt different from anything either of them had experienced before. There was no dramatic proposal, no grand declaration that instantly solved every fear they carried. Instead, they built something stronger, one ordinary day at a time. Mason and Laura continued meeting for breakfast every Saturday morning, taking long walks through the park, visiting bookstores, and exploring small towns neither had ever taken the time to appreciate. They laughed more easily now because they no longer felt the need to hide the parts of themselves shaped by loss. When painful memories surfaced, they didn't avoid them. They talked about them. Mason shared stories about the years that followed the end of the life he once imagined. Laura spoke openly about Michael and the lessons their marriage had left behind. Neither felt threatened by the other's past because they finally understood that genuine love doesn't demand forgotten memories. It simply asks for an honest heart. The people closest to them noticed the transformation almost immediately. Mason's daughter, Emily, watched her father become someone she hadn't seen in years. His laughter returned. His shoulders no longer carried the invisible weight that had followed him for so long. He began inviting family over for Sunday dinners again, something he had quietly stopped doing after convincing himself the house felt too empty. Friends who had nearly given up trying to reconnect with him suddenly found him saying yes to invitations he would once have politely declined. Daniel smiled one afternoon and admitted that he had almost forgotten what Mason looked like when he was genuinely happy. Laura experienced similar changes. Neighbors who had known her as the quiet woman who kept mostly to herself began seeing her gardening again, volunteering at the community center, and smiling in ways that reflected something much deeper than simple politeness. Together, without even realizing it, they had begun restoring parts of each other that neither thought could ever return. Nearly a year after that rainy afternoon in the bookstore, Mason asked Laura if she would meet him at the same lakeside bench where his journey had truly begun. She agreed without asking why. The morning was calm, much like the day they first crossed paths, with the sun slowly rising over the water. Mason arrived early, carrying nothing more than a small wooden box. When Laura joined him, they sat quietly for several minutes, watching gentle ripples move across the lake. Finally, Mason opened the box. Inside wasn't an expensive diamond ring or an extravagant gift. It was the old wedding band he had removed years earlier. Laura looked at him, confused. Mason smiled softly before speaking. For years, I kept this because I believed letting go meant forgetting everything that came before. Today, I finally understand that isn't true. He closed the box and placed it gently beside them on the bench. I'm not leaving my past behind. I'm simply choosing not to live there anymore. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and revealed another ring, one that represented not replacing yesterday, but embracing tomorrow. Looking into Laura's eyes, he quietly asked, "Would you spend whatever chapters we have left writing the rest of this story with me?" Through tears she could no longer hide, Laura whispered the only answer that mattered. Yes. Several months later, surrounded by family, close friends, and the people who had quietly prayed for their happiness, Mason and Laura exchanged vows beneath a canopy of oak trees in a small countryside venue. It wasn't a lavish wedding. There were no extravagant decorations or celebrity guests. But there was something far more valuable. There was gratitude. Gratitude for second chances. Gratitude for lessons learned through heartbreak. Gratitude for discovering that life often writes its most meaningful chapters long after we believe the story has reached its conclusion. During the reception, Emily stood to give short toast. Looking at her father with tears in her eyes, she smiled and said, "When Mom was gone, I thought I'd never see Dad truly happy again." Laura didn't replace what we lost. She reminded us that love has room to grow without asking us to forget. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Years later, neighbors would often see Mason and Laura walking hand in hand along the same lakeside path where he had once believed his future was over. Sometimes they sat together on the old wooden bench without speaking at all, simply appreciating the quiet company they had both searched for over so many lonely years. Young couples passed them without realizing the journey that had brought them there. Older couples smiled knowingly because they understood that the strongest love stories are rarely the ones that begin without pain. They're the ones that find hope after it seemed impossible to believe again. Mason often reflected on the lesson that had changed his life. He realized that the greatest mistake he had ever made wasn't trusting the wrong person or allowing himself to be hurt. His greatest mistake had been believing that one painful chapter had the authority to decide the ending of his entire story. Life had proven him wrong in the most beautiful way imaginable. One ordinary Tuesday, one quiet bookstore, one unexpected smile. Those simple moments became the beginning of a future he never thought he would have. If Mason had driven home instead of stopping to escape the rain, if Laura had reached for a different book, if either of them had allowed fear to make one more decision, their paths might never have crossed. Sometimes we spend years searching for extraordinary signs, when the moments that change our lives arrive looking completely ordinary. They appear as brief conversations, chance encounters, or unexpected invitations that seem too small to matter. Yet those are often the moments that quietly reshape our future. If this story leaves you with one lesson, let it be this. No matter how broken your heart has been, no matter how many years have passed, and no matter how convinced you are that love has already found its final chapter, life has a remarkable way of surprising those who haven't completely closed the door. The past may explain who you are, but it does not have to decide who you become. Sometimes the ending you feared was never the ending at all. Sometimes it was simply the page before the most meaningful chapter of your life began. Thank you for watching. Before you go, tell us in the comments, have you ever believed love was over, only for life to surprise you when you least expected it? We'd love to read your story. And if this journey touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another unforgettable story. Until next time, remember that hope has a way of finding those who are willing to believe that tomorrow can still hold something beautiful.